In this video, we're going to give you a very basic overview of some miscellaneous tools that you may come across. The first one is going to be a pry bar. In the previous video with screwdrivers, I said do not use screwdrivers as pry bars to pry things, right? That's what these bad boys are for. So you'll notice pry bars can actually come in all different lengths. They make them very tiny, and they make them very, very, very long, depending on what kind of job you're trying to do. Some pry bars are meant to give you some extra strength to hammer them from the backside, while others do not. So if it is metal, it may be strong enough for that. If it's plastic, I don't recommend that you hammer your pry bars to try to get them or squeeze them into a place that you need to. So you'll notice the very tip of the pry bar, and this one's pretty beat up, looks kind of like a screwdriver or even a chisel. It's sort of thin and tapered to get in between a space, and then you can move the pry bar up and down to pry open two components, like a cylinder head in a block or an intake manifold in a block, whatever it might be. But that's what pry bars are for prying. The larger the pry bar, the more leverage you'll have, but the more need for movement you'll also need. So if you don't have a ton of space, then you may need to use a really tiny pry bar. They do usually come in sets of 3 that look sort of like that, but they do make specialty pry bars that you can get in different lengths. So aside from pry bars, we have chisels. So chisels look kind of like this. So it almost looks like a pry bar at the tip, except it's not bent, but it is sort of sharp like a flat blade screwdriver, and then it tapers out. And then the back is meant to be hammered. So what you would do is sort of set up your chisel like that, and you would hammer the back. Now, why would you need a chisel? Well, if you are familiar with that term chisel, you might think of somebody cutting away at something like a piece of stone or something, right? Well, in automotive, there's a number of reasons you might use a chisel for. Maybe set nuts or bolts where you are actually creating sort of space where a flat blade screwdriver can come in to adjust it later. You can use the chisel to cut cold metals and notch areas. So anytime you want to make the shape of this or cut some sort of metal, maybe you're trying to get the head of a bolt off, something like that, chisels can be done for that. It's very important that chisels and or punches at the tip. This one's actually starting to mushroom out. These need to be grounded off, because what starts to happen is when the tip starts to mushroom, it'll start to fly off material. If you're not wearing safety glasses, that can be a problem for your eyes. Punches are very similar in nature. So they are meant to sort of be hammered, but there are so many different types of punches that have different types of tips on them. So this one happens to have sort of a flat tip. Well, this one I think maybe used to be, but is now a bit more rounded. This one is sort of like a center punch here. This one is going to be pointed. So maybe I want to cut a dimple into a piece of metal so I can drill into it. We'll call that a pilot hole, right? Others are to center material. Some are going to help drive bolts through a hole if you're trying to get it out. So depending on what it is you're trying to do, they make so many different types of punches. Here you can see that we're using a punch from the opposite side to drive out a bearing race. And this is actually what he's doing. He's using a carpenter's hammer, like I told you guys. But the flat face will still work the same. But he's using a punch to drive that bearing race out. A file, very much like, say, a nail file, right? So it's actually a lot bigger. So if we look at the surface, I don't know if you guys can see that. It's got like a bunch of lines going diagonally on there like this picture here. And you can see this person is filing a piece of metal. So what this is going to do is file, just like a nail file, right? We'll file off material from your nails. This file will file off whatever metal material off of whatever it is that you're filing. So if you're trying to maybe shape something, round something off, a file can actually take sort of metal off. You can almost think of it as like sanding, except it's a little bit more aggressive. They make files in all different shapes, depending on the shape that you're trying to file. The most important thing you're going to want to know about files is that they only work in one direction. So I'm just going to use this chisel here. If I'm trying to take material off of this chisel, I'm going to apply pressure in one direction and not in the other, because it's not going to work. So if you're applying pressure back, you're wasting energy and probably dulling the file. So apply pressure in one direction over and over, right? Let's say I'm trying to get that mushroom tip off of my chisel there. I'm going to apply pressure and let off when I come back. I don't even have to come back on it. So I apply pressure like that, right? So that's what files do. They make files in all different shapes and sizes. I've got a file here that's actually perfectly round. So let's say I want to file a hole that is round. I can use my round file. They have triangular shapes depending on, maybe I'm trying to get in between a corner or create a corner. So whatever shape you're trying to do or file, they've got a file for you. They make small, cheaper kits where it'll have a universal handle that you've got a set of files and they all use the same handle. Always use a file with a handle. It's not very safe to use one without one. And from time to time, they do need to be sharpened because they will dull out. Tap and dies. So earlier I mentioned that bolts can be stripped out from their head, right? The corners get stripped out, rounded out. But these lines on our bolt or a nut are called threads, kind of like threading a needle, right? Those threads can get damaged as well, maybe because of a foreign material, maybe because they weren't torqued properly, something like that. If they were stretched out because they weren't torqued properly, there's not that much you can do. But let's say because of a foreign material or debris, they sort of got damaged or eaten up. A die looks sort of round like this, and it's got a little flower shape in the middle there. But if we look even closer, there's actually threads inside of the die. And it's meant to go on a bolt, kind of like a nut. And as you turn the die on there, those threads inside the die, this is actually much stronger than metal than most bolts. And so it will actually cut new threads or clean up old threads and help you out there. So you're not just going to use the die, you're going to use some sort of die wrench or handle that's going to hold the die in place. Anytime you're cutting new threads or cleaning stuff up, you definitely want to use some sort of lubrication because it's going to create some heat, and the last thing you want to do is break the die or a tap because they're hardened metal. So you can see here in this picture, die stock, that was the term I was trying to use here. They're cleaning up the threads on a stud or a bolt. That's what that would be used for. The tap looks like a bolt, sort of. So if we look at that, except it has like these channels, right? Besides that, it looks like a bolt, but these are very sharp. You can actually cut yourself on them. They're so sharp. So you'll find the tap or die that fits the same exact threads of your bolt, and it can clean up the threads. So just like the die, the tap can be ran through a nut or a bolt hole in a block, again, using lubrication. Also, when you're using a tap and die, buy a nice set. You buy a cheap one from Harbor Freight, you're going to get what you pay for. The next thing is don't just sort of crank it through with a lot of force, because what will happen, you'll build up heat and you may end up breaking the tap inside. Now, breaking a bolt inside of a block's one thing, pain in the butt. Breaking a tap inside of something is much, much worse, because normally if you break a bolt, you will use a hardened drill bit to drill a hole in the bolt, and then you'll try to sort of ease it out with an extractor. We'll talk about that in a moment. Sorry, what if you broke the hardened piece of metal? Now what am I supposed to use to drill it out? So that's the danger of breaking a tap. So to prevent something like that from happening, You start it first straight because, again, this is meant to cut the threads. And if you start cutting crooked, it will cut crooked. So start it straight and then sort of run it through the threads. When it starts to get hard, right, and you're actually having to apply pressure, again, using lubrication, turn it 2 times clockwise to tighten, and then turn it once counterclockwise. 2 times to tighten, once counterclockwise. So we're turning it in 2 times and backing it out once. This is going to prevent, or at least try to help prevent, the building up of heat and sort of galling and seizing the tap or die on the material. So just a tech tip for you, but that's what taps and dies are used for. They also have tap wrenches that have T-handles to help you turn the tap when it does get a little too hard. If it's starting to get really, really hard, be careful. Start backing it off and then just sort of ease your way because, again, breaking taps sucks. So here's an example. We've got a tap going into a bolt hole, possibly into a cylinder head or a block, trying to cut threads. Here we have a die that you can see the shavings of metal down here in your slides that are provided on Canvas. Our die is sort of cleaning up or cutting threads here on this stud. Now, when the worst happens, right, and you break that bolt, you would use an extractor set. So let's say you broke a bolt or the head came off of a bolt and you're trying to tighten or loosen in a block or some sort of piece, and you need to get it out. And now it doesn't have a head or the head stripped, whatnot. You're going to use some sort of extractor. So an extractor set is going to come with reverse drill bits and extractors. So you are going to use the reverse drill bit and you are going to drill in a sort of hole, start of a hole into the bolt that you broke. And then you are going to take the extractor, and this is a different type of extractor, but they both do the same thing. Here's a closer picture. That extractor is going to go into the hole that you drilled, and you are going to try to loosen it, and these sort of lines here are going to grip the bolt and hopefully turn it out. That's your only way of really gripping the bolt. These rarely work the first time around. It does take sort of a finesse, a feel and care to eventually get the hang of how to do these. If you're talking about a rusted bolt, make sure you're using a lot of penetrant. These can be, sometimes you get lucky and it's your first time, you get it out. Sometimes you will fight this thing all day. So good luck extracting broken bolts. If we can avoid broken bolts to begin with, that's really that's really what we want, right? So if you're dealing with some rusty hardware, always use some sort of penetrant like PB Blaster to loosen that rust up. And if a bolt really starts to get tough, heating up the material can also help. But no matter how hard you try, eventually you will break a bolt and you're going to need to learn how to use one of these bad boys. They also have ones that will help grip a head if the head is stripped out, or let's say you stripped the corners on a nut. They do have outside extractors as well. Let's talk a little bit about some common measuring tools that you're going to come across. The first one, most of you guys have already seen, your handy dandy tape measure, right? So the only reason I do talk about this is because I did used to teach high school and they don't really teach you guys how to read one of these. So real quick, I just sort of gave you a little breakdown. Most of the time they'll have 2 sides to them, one that's standard in inches and the other side that's generally centimeters. So if you don't know how to read one of these, it's just like a ruler. Here's a little trick I like to teach my high school students when I used to teach high school, is you can count from inch line to inch line how many lines there are. If there's 32, then when you go to measure something, we'll say there's 16 lines, right, in between. Because there's generally going to be 8, 16, 32, those are common. Whatever you measure, let's say we measure up to our half mark here. Let's say out of 16 lines total, it lined up with line number 8. Well, we know that 8 out of 16 can be reduced down to 1/2. right? 8 goes into 16 2 times. So that reduces down to 1/2. All you have to do at that point is reduce the fraction. So that would be a great way to start. However many lines out of 16. So I have total lines of 16, and whatever I'm measuring lines up with 4. Then I'm going to take 4/16 and I'm going to reduce it. If it can't be reduced, then you'll just take that number 13/16. Your measurement is 13/16. If it goes past the inch line into before 2 inches, and let's say it lines up with 13/16, that would be 1 inch and 13/16. So that's just the basics of how to read a ruler. The best thing you could do is try to practice at home. Tape measures are not very expensive. Another measuring tool that you can use are called calipers. So the older designs are called vernier calipers. They call this a vernier scale. Kind of like, again, reading a ruler, except a little bit different. We'll get into this when you get into an engine class. I will do a whole tutorial video on how to read these. A dial caliper is very similar, so you'll take the reading and then you'll add whatever is on the dial. But if you're lazy, you can get yourself a digital caliper. It does all the work for you, something like this. And the cool part about calipers is that they measure a bunch of different things. So this one's actually off because it doesn't really zero out. Well, that's no good, right? Let's zero that out. And we'll put it to inches. This caliper has a little wheel. All the calipers are going to have a little wheel. And that little wheel is going to either open or close our caliper that you can see here. So we can measure 3 things. We can measure the outside diameter of something. I can measure the inside diameter of something with my little teeth back here. And I've got a depth gauge down here. So that's pretty cool. And the digital caliper will just tell me my number, whatever that may be, on my display here. So digital calipers are nice. You can seriously get one of these at Harbor Freight for like less than 20 bucks, probably 25 bucks maybe. So these are fairly cheap. Anytime you're using measuring tools, especially ones like calipers and micrometers, you're going to want to always make sure you check the accuracy before you use them in case they're off and need to be calibrated. The next type of measuring tool is a micrometer. Now, I won't get into really how to read the micrometer. I'll talk a little bit about it right now, but I do want to let you guys know that I will in the future, especially in your engine class and brakes class, things like that, I will teach you guys in depth on how to read a micrometer. And eventually, if I get some time, I may throw a video together on a tutorial on how to read a micrometer. In the meantime, I just want you to know what they are. So when I'm measuring things, we may measure down to, a 1/16 of an inch, or even a 32nd of an inch. That seems pretty small. But what about if I'm building engines? If I'm building engines, I may need to read down to 1/1000th of an inch, or even 10,000ths of an inch. So what does that look like? That is 3 decimal places to the left. So that would be 0.001, right? A 10,000th of an inch is going to be 0.0001. This is very, very tiny. We'll say a sheet of paper out of your binder, a lined sheet of paper, is 3/1000ths of an inch. So we're talking very, very tiny measurements that are very, very important to know if you're dealing with something like an engine. If I'm 3/1000ths off on a bearing, that can be a bad issue. So it's important to be able to measure down that far. And that's what micrometers are for, is to measure very tiny, tiny amounts. So I will just sort of break down the micrometer here. Here's a closer look. Right now this one's all the way close, but as I turn our thimble here, you can see it's starting to open up more and more and more and more. Well, let me break this whole piece down. Take a good look at that. This is very similar, right? So we've got, and this is in your slides on Canvas, we've got an anvil that's at the end here, that sort of little tip there. We've got a spindle that sort of moves in and out as we measure. This whole U-shaped piece is called a frame. And then we have sleeve, barrel, and burr. So there's our we use sometimes called a thimble as well to read our micrometer. So if we were to take a close-up look at that, there's also a lock too. Here's our sleeve, here's our barrel, here's our sleeve, here's our barrel. This is going to be a metric micrometer. This is going to be a standard micrometer. And when my lines will line up with certain lines, I can get my reading. So on a standard micrometer, there are 3 lines in between each large number from 0 to 1, from 1 to 2. Each one of these is going to be 25 thousandths of an inch. The next one would be 50. The next one would be 75 thousandths of an inch, kind of like money, right? And then we get 100 thousandths of an inch. 125, 150, 175, 200 thousandths of an inch, so on and so forth. And then we will add our numbers on the end here. So if it lines up with 2, let's say it lined up with the second line. So it's 150 thousandths of an inch plus 2 thousandths. I'm being very vague here, so if you're not following along, don't worry about it. I will eventually make a tutorial video on how to read micrometers. In this class, you don't necessarily need to know how to read one, but when you do get to a brakes class or an engine class, we will show you guys how to read micrometers, and whether you like it or not, we're going to force you to practice and practice and practice until you actually know how to read one. So that's micrometers. They do, I spoke about thousandths of an inch and 10 thousandths of an inch. They go down to 0.01 millimeters, which is the equivalent sort of, it's very, very tiny. So when you're making those precise measurements where it's really necessary to get that far down, micrometers are your jam. Here would be another example of reading a standard micrometer. So if you want to follow this through, here's sort of the money example. This is not a good example where the decimal point is because it's not really the same, but the numbers are the same. As I mentioned, each one of these is 25 thousandths. So that's 0.025. Next one is 0.050, 0.075, and then 0.100. Unless it's 1 inch and how many thousandths of an inch. So that's just in a nutshell how you read a standard micrometer. Metric micrometers are a little bit different. Each tiny line, which there is 5 on the bottom and 4 on top. Each tiny line in between are big numbers. So you'll notice it doesn't say 0 and 1. Now it says 0 and 5. That's because each one of these tiny numbers are going to be essentially 0.5. So I've got 0, half a millimeter, that'd be 1 millimeter, 1.5, 2 millimeters, 2.5, 3 millimeters, 3.5, 4 millimeters, 4.5, and now you have our 5 millimeters. So some people think standard's easier, some people think metric's easier. I honestly think they're both equally as easy to read. It really depends on what you practice or maybe what your background knowledge is. But once you get the hang of these, they're not bad. It's really just about practice, practice, practice. Let's say I need to know if there's any movement in a component, maybe a crankshaft or a brake rotor. A dial indicator is also going to measure thousandths of an inch, but in a dial. And it'll have a little needle that moves in and out of that dial. So if my needle moves 200 thousandths of an inch, it's going to show me on my dial. That's essentially what a dial indicator is. We'll get into that in, again, probably a brakes and or in engine class. A set of feeler gauges looks kind of like this, and you can sort of push them out here, and there are a bunch of fingers. This is a special kind of feeler gauge that has an angle on it. Each one of these fingers are a different thickness on them, and I'll even show you, if we look close enough, you guys can probably see, if it'll focus here, there are numbers on that feeler gauge. And that's going to tell me how thick it is in inches and or millimeters. So if I need to know the space between something, maybe a piston ring gap, My feeler gauge can help me figure that out. And actually, they can be used for valve adjustments as well. And they make a bunch of different kinds. They make that are non-magnetic. They make go, no-go gauges. We'll get into that when you get into a tune-up class. Here is a straight edge and a feeler gauge used to check the warpage of a deck surface or unevenness of a deck surface. Here is a feeler gauge being used for a valve adjustment to adjust they call it valve lash, but the amount of space in our valve train. We'll get into that again in a tune-up class and an engine rebuild class for upper. But feeler gauges are meant to check the amount of space between two components that is very thin. They have ones that are down to 1/1000th of an inch, and that sucker is thinner than a piece of paper. It's actually really easy to break, and they're almost always broken. Those are all of the tools. Thank you for hanging in there. I know it was a lot. If you need to go back and rewatch it, I would understand. Please join me in this week's Zoom session with questions so I can help you guys out. If you have any questions at all, please either leave a comment, leave an inbox message on Canvas, or email. But I will see you guys in the Zoom meeting this week.